Evelyn Harper was the town's golden girl. Claire Maddox was her quiet, loyal shadow. 30 years ago, only one of them walked back from the cliffs, and no one could prove why, until a single mistake shattered decades of silence. The summer of 1995 in Brookhaven began like any other, warm sea breezes carrying the scent of salt water, the chatter of tourists filling the narrow boardwalk, and the sound of gulls crying overhead. It was the kind of place where nothing truly shocking ever happened, or at least that's what the townsfolk believed. Days were predictable, nights were quiet, and everyone knew each other's business. But underneath the sunlit calm, something darker was beginning to stir, though no one yet realized it. Evelyn Harper was the kind of person who seemed untouchable. At 25, she had the look of someone destined for bigger things, a graceful presence, a magnetic charm, and a way of making every conversation feel like you were the only one in the room. People trusted her easily. They admired the way she carried herself, confident but never arrogant, always dressed as though she had stepped out of a magazine. She worked at the town's small real estate office, but everyone knew she was aiming for something grander, a life far from Brookhaven's weather-worn fishing docks. Her closest friend, Claire Maddox, was nothing like her. Claire was quieter, softer in presence, with a gentle smile that rarely demanded attention but lingered in memory. While Evelyn was the center of every gathering, Claire often stayed at the edges, observing with calm, unhurried eyes. She had lived in Brookhaven her whole life, working at the local library and caring for her elderly father. She didn't crave the spotlight, in fact, she avoided it. Yet somehow, despite their differences, she and Evelyn had been inseparable since childhood. Then there was Daniel Reed, tall, reserved, and with a certain mystery about him. He had moved to Brookhaven only a year earlier, taking over a small boat repair shop near the pier. The moment he entered Evelyn's life, it seemed as though her attention shifted entirely toward him. But Daniel was friendly with Claire too, friendly enough to be noticed. Some people whispered that they had grown closer than they should have, though no one dared say it aloud in front of Evelyn. That summer, the tension between the two women began to show in ways most people dismissed at first. A missed phone call here, a polite smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, a sudden change in plans that left one or the other absent from group outings. Still, Brookhaven was not a place where people looked for trouble. They preferred to believe that any cracks in a friendship could be patched over. On a warm July evening, the town gathered for a beach party to celebrate the annual sailing festival. The bonfire burned high, casting shifting shadows across the sand. Music played from a crackling speaker, and the air was filled with laughter and the faint smell of roasting food. Evelyn was there in a flowing white dress, drawing glances from everyone. Claire was there too, in a simple blue sundress, her hair tied back against the breeze. Daniel moved between them, smiling politely, but his glances, quick, almost cautious, did not go unnoticed. At some point during the night, the bonfire became the only light on the beach. The tide was low and the cliffs at the far end of the shore loomed darker than usual. Claire was last seen walking toward them, her silhouette small against the rock. A few people assumed she was stepping away for air or a moment of quiet. Evelyn was spotted a short time later, heading in the same direction, her movements brisk, purposeful. No one paid much attention to the time then, but later, when it was asked, no one could agree exactly how long it had been before Evelyn returned alone. She looked calm, perhaps a little windblown from the sea air. Claire, however, did not return at all. At first, people thought she had gone home early. But by morning, when her bed had not been slept in and her father reported her missing, a ripple of unease began to spread through Brookhaven. Search teams scoured the cliffs and shoreline, their flashlights sweeping across jagged rocks and tide pools. The water was searched, but no trace of Claire was found. Not a footprint, not a scrap of fabric, nothing. The official report would later say that she vanished without a trace, possibly swept out to sea. But there were quiet conversations behind closed doors, unspoken suspicions that something else had happened that night. And though no one could prove it, A few people remembered the way Evelyn had walked back from the cliffs, alone, composed and carrying something small in her hand. Something that in the dim firelight caught the glow for only a second before disappearing into the folds of her dress. The days after Claire's disappearance passed in a haze of unanswered questions. Posters with her photograph appeared on lampposts, at the library, and in the windows of the small bakery she used to frequent. Search parties went out daily, combing the cliffs, the beach, and the woods beyond town. Helicopters circled overhead, their shadows sliding across the coastline. The smell of the sea seemed heavier somehow, as if carrying the weight of what had happened. People whispered to each other in grocery store aisles, in the pews of the old church, on the docks. Everyone wanted to believe she might still be found. But as weeks passed without a trace, the hope began to fade. The police investigation stalled. No one had seen Claire after she walked toward the cliffs. There was no evidence of a struggle, no signs of her belongings, and the currents could have carried a body far from the coast. Without something solid, the authorities labeled it an unfortunate accident. A possible fall followed by the tide's merciless sweep. Evelyn didn't attend every search effort. She claimed she was too distraught, staying home for long stretches. When she did appear in public, her composure drew mixed reactions. Some thought it was her way of staying strong, while others found it strange that her grief didn't seem raw, at least not in the way they expected. Daniel stayed mostly silent, offering to help when asked but avoiding long conversations about Claire. He kept his shop open, though he was seen staring out at the water more often than working on boats. The investigation's end didn't mean the story was forgotten. It lived on in hushed tones, particularly among those who had been at the party that night. There was talk of an argument, of a shift in Evelyn and Claire's friendship in the weeks before, but without proof, suspicion was just that. Suspicion. Life in Brookhaven eventually returned to its usual pace. Tourists came and went. The fishing boats continued their early morning routines, and the seasons moved on. Evelyn left town the following year, her departure unremarkable on the surface. She told neighbors she had a job opportunity in the city, and not long after, she married Daniel. Together they built a life away from the coast, far from the people who remembered Claire's disappearance. Over the years, Evelyn's new life began to look picture-perfect. She wore expensive clothes, hosted elegant dinners, and became known for her charitable work. There were photographs of her shaking hands with local officials, smiling at community events, standing at the center of every gathering, yet none ever included any reference to Claire. It was as if her best friend had never existed. But not everyone forgot. Detective Laura Hayes, who had been a rookie when Claire vanished, kept the case alive in her own way. She had gone over every report, every witness statement, dozens of times. Something about it had never sat right with her. She remembered Evelyn's calm that night, remembered the lack of evidence, remembered the peculiar detail that Claire's silver bracelet, a gift from her late mother, had never been found. As the decades passed, Laura rose through the ranks, retired and moved away, but she never discarded the case file. It stayed in a drawer in her desk at home, a quiet reminder of a mystery unresolved. Every so often she would take it out, read through the pages, and wonder if she had overlooked something. By 2025, 30 years had passed since that July night. Evelyn was now a wealthy widow, Daniel having died in an accident several years earlier. She lived in a sprawling home, filled with polished furniture, old photographs, and carefully chosen art. To anyone who met her now, she seemed like the kind of person untouched by scandal, a woman whose life was marked only by success and generosity. But beneath the surface of her perfect life, the shadow of Claire Maddox still lingered, silent, unacknowledged, but never truly gone. It would take just one small, almost careless moment to bring that shadow back into the light. And when it happened, 30 years of carefully maintained silence would begin to unravel. It began with something so ordinary that at first it seemed meaningless. Early that spring, Evelyn attended the annual Brookhaven Charity Gala, an event she rarely missed. The hall was filled with the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the flicker of candlelight, reflecting off crystal chandeliers. Photographers moved between the guests, capturing images for the society pages and the local newspaper. Evelyn, as always, was radiant. Her black evening gown shimmered under the lights, her hair swept into a perfect chignon. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, smiling at acquaintances, shaking hands, and posing for photographs as though she had been born for moments like this. The following week, the Brookhaven Gazette ran a short article covering the event. The piece was unremarkable: 2 columns of text, a list of attendees, and a small set of photographs. Most people who glanced at the page didn't linger, but in a quiet house several miles away, retired Detective Laura Hayes stopped mid-sip of her morning coffee when her eyes fell on one particular photograph. It showed Evelyn standing beside the mayor, her hand resting lightly at her side. There, on her wrist, was a bracelet, silver delicate, with a single seashell charm. Laura's breath caught. She knew that bracelet. She had seen it before, but not on Evelyn. 30 years ago it had been a treasured possession of Claire Maddox. In one of the last photographs ever taken of Claire, taken at the beach party on the night she vanished, that bracelet had gleamed faintly under the bonfire's light. It was even listed in the missing property report after her disappearance. The bracelet had never been found. For Laura, the sight of it was like hearing a locked door creak open after decades of silence. Questions surged in her mind. Why was Evelyn wearing it now, after all these years? Where had she kept it? And more importantly, how had she gotten it in the first place? Her thoughts churned back to the old case. There had been no proof, no body, nothing tangible to tie Evelyn to what had happened that night. And yet something about her composure had always bothered Laura. She had looked like someone who had not just survived a tragedy, but had already rehearsed how to live with it. Seeing that bracelet now was more than a loose thread. It was a connection, a piece of the puzzle that had been missing for 3 decades. Laura leaned back in her chair, the newspaper spread across the table, her mind working through every detail she could remember. She thought about the Tide reports from that night, the gaps in witness timelines, the way Evelyn had returned from the cliffs alone. She remembered the strange stillness in her eyes, and how, in the chaos of the search, no one had noticed what she had been holding. She told herself she might be wrong, that perhaps the bracelet was a coincidence, a look-alike, something bought at a market. But deep down, she knew the seashell charm was unique, handmade, with a tiny flaw in its surface that she had noticed when cataloging the original missing property list. It wasn't something mass-produced, it was personal. The realization left Laura with a sense of urgency she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a memory anymore, it was a fresh lead. And if Evelyn had been careless enough to wear that bracelet in public, there was a chance she had made other mistakes, ones that could finally reveal the truth. She folded the newspaper carefully, placed it beside her on the table, and stared out the window. Brookhaven had kept its secrets for a long time, but secrets had a way of slipping loose when least expected. For the first time in 30 years, Laura felt the weight of the case shift. Somewhere in the polished life Evelyn Harper had built, the cracks were beginning to show, and Laura intended to follow every one of them until she reached whatever Evelyn had tried so hard to bury. Laura knew that reopening an investigation without official authority was risky, but the bracelet had ignited something in her that could not be ignored. She began by revisiting the old case file, spreading its yellowed pages across her dining table. There were grainy photographs from the 1995 beach party, witness statements scribbled in uneven handwriting, and tide charts showing the sea's movements that night. Every detail was familiar, yet now, with the bracelet in mind, they seemed sharper, more urgent. She decided to start with the people who had been there. Many had moved away or grown old, their memories faded and unreliable. But there were still a few in Brookhaven who remembered. One name stood out: Mark Jensen, a retired fisherman who had often worked near the cliffs. Back then he had claimed he saw 2 figures by the cliff edge on the night Claire disappeared, though he couldn't be sure of their identities. Laura wondered if time had loosened his tongue, if maybe now, with the years behind them, he might be willing to say more. She found him living in a weathered house near the docks, the smell of salt and engine oil lingering in the air. Mark's face was lined from years at sea, his hands calloused and rough. At first he seemed hesitant to talk, but when Laura mentioned the bracelet, something in his expression shifted. He admitted he had always believed the two figures he'd seen were Evelyn and Claire. He remembered how they had stood close together, the waves crashing below, the wind tearing at their hair. He recalled an abrupt movement, one figure stepping forward, the other stumbling back toward the edge, then only one remained. Mark's account filled in a gap. Laura had always suspected. The tide had been unusually low that night, exposing jagged rocks and revealing a narrow strip of beach beneath the cliffs. If someone had fallen, their body could have been hidden in one of the tidal caves, inaccessible until the water returned to sweep it away. The idea had been considered in 1995, but without evidence it had gone nowhere. Now Laura began tracing Evelyn's movements in the days after the disappearance. The records showed she had skipped several search efforts, claiming to be unwell, but there was a small, easily overlooked note in one of the reports. A fisherman had spotted her near an old boathouse, 2 days after Claire vanished. At the time, it had seemed irrelevant. Laura saw it differently. The boathouse, long abandoned, sat in a secluded inlet where the tides could deposit anything the ocean carried. She visited the location, the wooden structure, leaning at odd angles, its roof sagging with age. Inside, dust coated every surface, and the air was heavy with the smell of mildew. Old fishing nets hung from the rafters, brittle with time. She moved carefully, scanning every corner, her eyes drawn to a stack of wooden crates in the shadows. They were old but not ancient, their boards weathered but still intact. Something about them felt out of place, as though they had been hidden there deliberately. She didn't open them right away. Instead, she photographed the scene from every angle, documenting what she saw. Her instincts told her she was standing on the edge of a discovery that could shatter Evelyn's carefully constructed life. The bracelet had been the first thread, but this could be the knot that tied everything together. Outside, the wind rattled the boathouse walls, and the tide lapped quietly against the shore. Laura felt the weight of the years pressing in, but also the unmistakable pull of the truth drawing closer. Somewhere among these rotting boards and forgotten nets, she believed the past was waiting to be found, ready to speak after 30 years of silence. Laura returned to the boathouse the next morning, the early light filtering through a thin mist that clung to the shoreline. She had barely slept, her mind replaying Mark Jensen's account and the way those crates had seemed to hold more than just forgotten fishing gear. The tide was low again, exposing patches of wet sand littered with shells and seaweed. Every creak of the boathouse seemed louder in the stillness, as though the building itself had been holding its breath for 30 years. Inside, the air was damp and cold, carrying the faint tang of salt. Dust motes swirled in thin beams of light, breaking through the gaps in the wood. Laura's flashlight cut across the crates in the corner, the shadows retreating reluctantly. She approached slowly, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight. Kneeling, she ran her hand along the warped wood, feeling the rough edges where nails had rusted over. The lid of the nearest crate was wedged tight, sealed by time and moisture. She pried at it carefully, her hand steady despite the pounding in her chest. The lid gave way with a sharp crack, the sound echoing through the empty boathouse. A stale, mossy odor escaped, thick and sour, as though the air inside had been trapped for decades. Beneath a layer of rotted canvas lay a bundle wrapped in a decayed tarp, its shape irregular but unmistakable in its weight and form. Laura hesitated only a moment before peeling the tarp back. What remained was little more than bone fragile, weathered, but unmistakably human. She sat back on her heels, staring at the skeletal outline, her mind refusing to blink away the reality of what she was seeing. Resting beside the remains were scraps of faded fabric, their color dulled but still recognizable as the deep blue of the sundress Claire Maddox had worn the night she disappeared. The material was torn, frayed at the edges, as if it had been ripped in a violent struggle. A glint of something small caught her eye. She reached in carefully, brushing away the grime until her fingers closed around the object. A torn photograph, warped and spotted from years of dampness. It showed Evelyn and Claire together, their faces lit by sunlight, smiles bright and easy. But the edges of the photo were jagged, as though someone had ripped it in half, separating them from something or someone else in the frame. Laura's breath slowed. Every piece of this scene told a story, one the official records had never captured. The bracelet Evelyn had worn so casually at the gala had been missing from Claire's body, but the rest of her possessions had been here all along, sealed away in a place Evelyn must have known no one would search. She pulled out her phone, snapping photographs from every angle, the remains, the fabric, the photograph. Each image was another nail in the coffin of Evelyn Harper's 30-year deception. But Laura knew that finding the remains was only the beginning. She still needed to prove the connection, to link the bracelet to Claire conclusively, and to show that Evelyn had kept these items hidden deliberately. Outside, the tide began to creep back in, waves hissing softly against the sand. Laura looked around the boathouse one last time, imagining Evelyn walking in here all those years ago, carrying the weight of what she had done. She could almost see her placing the bundle into the crate, sealing it shut, and walking away without a backward glance. For 30 years, the ocean had guarded its secret. Now, the boathouse had surrendered it. And Laura knew that once the truth surfaced, there would be no putting it back into the dark. The walls Evelyn had built around her life were about to crack, and when they fell, they would bury her along with the lies she had lived by. News of the discovery spread quickly, but Laura made sure the details remained tightly controlled until the forensic results came back. The remains were taken to the state lab, where specialists worked to confirm what Laura already knew in her gut, that the bones belonged to Claire Maddox. It didn't take long. Dental records, compared against the brittle jawbone, left no room for doubt. After 3 decades of uncertainty, Claire's body had been found. With that confirmation came a chain reaction. The bracelet Evelyn had worn at the gala was seized and tested. Microscopic traces of fabric fibers matched the sundress found in the crate. Even more damning, a faded trace of DNA too degraded for a perfect profile, but consistent with Claire's genetic markers, was embedded in the tiny clasp. It was enough to establish a physical link between Evelyn and Claire on the night of the disappearance, a link Evelyn had unknowingly paraded in front of cameras. Laura's next step was to reconstruct the timeline from 30 years ago with the new evidence. Mark Jensen's account of the 2 figures on the cliffs, the tidal cave theory, and the boathouse location, all slotted neatly together now. It painted a picture that was both chilling and deliberate. Evelyn had confronted Claire that night, the argument escalating until Claire was pushed over the edge. The low tide had left her broken body on the rocks below. Evelyn, realizing she could not leave her there, had waited for the cover of darkness and moved Claire's remains to the boathouse, sealing them away where no one would find them. The sea took care of any immediate trace, and the decades buried the rest. The arrest came quietly. Officers arrived at Evelyn's estate early in the morning, their footsteps crunching across the frost-dusted driveway. She answered the door in a silk robe, her expression one of confusion that quickly hardened into something unreadable when she saw Laura standing behind them. Evelyn had been prepared for many things in her life, but not this. As the charges were read, first-degree murder, she stood motionless, her eyes locked on Laura's. There was no outburst, no denial, only the faint tightening of her jaw. The trial drew the town of Brookhaven back into the past it had tried to forget. Old witnesses were called, photographs from the party projected on courtroom screens, and the bracelet, the small glittering piece of evidence that had unraveled everything, was displayed for the jury. Prosecutors revealed Evelyn's motive, laying bare the jealousy that had festered when she suspected Daniel's attention had shifted toward Claire. Her carefully curated life, built over decades, was dismantled piece by piece. Laura attended every session, watching as Evelyn's mask began to crack under the weight of testimony. The woman who had once glided through parties now sat under harsh courtroom lights, her posture stiff, her gaze occasionally flicking toward the jury as if searching for a hint of sympathy, but there was none. The evidence was too compelling, the story too clear. When the verdict came, the room was silent except for the foreman's voice. Guilty. Evelyn Harper, once Brookhaven's golden girl, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time in 30 years, the name Claire Maddox was spoken in the town not as a question, but as a truth. After the sentencing, Laura stood outside the courthouse, the winter air biting against her skin. She thought about the years the case had lingered in her mind, about the file that had never left her desk, about the moment she had seen the bracelet in that photograph. It was strange how such a small object could topple an entire life of lies. Evelyn had hidden her crime for 3 decades, building walls high enough to keep suspicion out, but it had been her own vanity, her belief that the past was safely buried, that had finally undone her. Brookhaven returned to its slow rhythms, but the cliffs, the boathouse, and the cold expanse of the ocean seemed to hold a heavier silence now. The truth had come out, but it had taken 30 years to surface, and for those who had lived through that summer of 1995, the knowledge would never quite fade, that in the most familiar places, the darkest secrets can lie hidden in plain sight.